In the dead of winter, single mother Sarah stood with her 4 children outside a collapsing barn they had just inherited, the only thing left by a grandfather she barely remembered. With 8-year-old twin boys shivering beside her and 7-year-old twin girls clinging to her coat, she stared at the structure everyone in town called worthless. The property taxes alone would bury them. But when her eldest son found a rusted key hidden in a rotting beam, and her daughter noticed strange symbols carved into the ancient stone foundation, Sarah realized the family's decades of poverty might have been guarding something extraordinary. What could be hidden beneath a structure the entire county had dismissed as condemned? Why had her grandfather lived his final years in complete isolation, protecting a barn that seemed ready to collapse? And what secret was worth $200 million that no one had discovered in over 50 years? The fluorescent lights in the law office of Sterling and Associates hummed with a persistent, irritating drone that seemed to bore directly into Sarah Martinez's skull, a fitting soundtrack to a day that had already stripped away what little hope she'd been clinging to. She sat in a cracked leather chair that had seen better decades, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to ignore the throbbing exhaustion that came from working a double shift at the diner, followed by 4 hours stocking shelves at the supermarket, all while her 4 children had stayed with a neighbor who was already doing her too many favors. At 32, Sarah looked older, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, her face showing the fine lines that came not from laughter but from worry, from calculating whether she could afford both the electric bill and her daughter's antibiotics, from the constant mathematical torture of poverty. Beside her sat her cousin Derek, 15 years older, and radiating the particular smugness of a man who had inherited his father's construction business and believed his wealth was evidence of virtue rather than luck. The lawyer, Mr. Hendricks, was a tired man in his 70s, with spectacles that kept sliding down his nose as he read from the last will and testament of Thomas Martinez, a grandfather Sarah had met perhaps 3 times in her entire life, a man who had been described to her only as difficult and strange by her late mother. Hendricks cleared his throat and began the reading, his voice carrying the practiced monotone of someone who had presided over hundreds of family disappointments. The house in town, a modest but well-maintained property worth perhaps $200,000, went to Derek, along with $75,000 in cash savings and Thomas's truck, while Sarah, the only grandchild from Thomas's estranged daughter, received something the lawyer described with barely concealed pity as the barn property. Derek actually laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement that echoed in the small office. The old barn, that falling down wreck out past Millbrook. Sarah, I'd say you got the short end of the stick, but honestly, you got nothing at all. That place is worthless, probably costs more to demolish than it's worth. Hendricks adjusted his spectacles and continued reading, his voice taking on a more serious tone as he explained that the barn and the 40 acres it sat on were indeed Sarah's. But there was a significant complication. $15,000 in back property taxes had accumulated over the past decade, taxes that Thomas had apparently ignored, and the county required payment within 90 days, or the property would be seized and sold at auction to satisfy the debt. Sarah felt the words wash over her like cold water, her mind already doing the desperate mathematics. $15,000 was more than she made in 6 months, more than she'd ever had in her bank account at one time in her entire adult life, and the notion of inheriting anything, even something worthless, now felt like a cruel joke, another burden added to shoulders already compressed under the weight of survival. Derek stood, shaking Hendricks's hand with the easy confidence of a man whose problems could all be solved with money, and as he passed Sarah's chair, he placed a hand on her shoulder with performative sympathy. Look, Sarah, if you want to sign the property over to me, I'll handle the tax situation and spare you the headache. I might be able to salvage some value from the land, though honestly, I'd be doing you a favor. She looked up at him, seeing in his eyes the same dismissive pity she'd seen in the faces of every social worker, every bill collector, every person who had ever looked at her and seen only poverty, only failure. And something inside her, some small flame she hadn't known was still burning, flickered with defiance, and she heard herself saying words she hadn't planned. No, thank you, Derek. I'll handle my own inheritance. The drive from town took 40 minutes on increasingly deteriorating roads, the last 5 miles little more than 2 rutted tracks through tall grass that scraped against the sides of Sarah's ancient minivan. A 2003 Honda Odyssey with 240,000 miles on it and a worrying knocking sound that grew louder with each passing week. In the back seats, her 4 children pressed their faces against the windows with the resilient curiosity that poverty had not yet managed to extinguish from them. Marcus and Matteo, her 8-year-old twin boys, were mirror images of each other with dark hair and quick brown eyes, already arguing about whether they'd see bears or wolves on the property, while 7-year-old twins Lucia and Elena sat behind them, quieter but no less observant, Lucia clutching the worn stuffed rabbit she'd had since she was 2, and Elena holding the small notebook where she drew everything she saw. When the barn finally came into view as they crested a small rise, Sarah's foot actually slipped off the gas pedal in shock, and the minivan rolled to a stop in the middle of the overgrown track. It was massive, far larger than she'd imagined from the dismissive way Derek had described it. A towering structure that must have been 60 feet long and 40 feet wide, with a steep peaked roof that reached toward the gray Montana sky like the hull of a capsized ship. But its size only made its decay more heartbreaking. The wood was silvered with age and weather. Several boards hung loose or missing entirely. The roof sagged dramatically in the middle, as though the building were slowly folding in on itself, and the entire structure leaned slightly to the left in a way that made Sarah's stomach clench with fear. The land surrounding it was a wilderness of waist-high grass, wild shrubs, and scattered pine trees that had begun to reclaim what had once clearly been pasture. And in the distance, she could see the dark line of forest that marked the edge of the property. The children tumbled out of the van before she'd even turned off the engine, their voices bright with excitement as they ran toward the barn, and Sarah wanted to call them back, to protect them from the disappointment she knew was coming, but her voice caught in her throat. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, her hands still gripping the steering wheel, doing the calculations that had become her constant mental companion. The structure was clearly unsafe and would need to be condemned or repaired, repairs that would cost tens of thousands, money she didn't have, couldn't borrow, couldn't imagine possessing. And the property taxes looming in 90 days felt like a countdown to the inevitable moment when she'd lose even this broken dream. She watched Marcus and Matteo disappear around the side of the barn, heard Lucia's delighted laugh as she discovered something in the tall grass, saw Elena standing perfectly still, just staring up at the massive doors with an expression of wonder. And Sarah felt the crushing weight of her failure as a mother. The knowledge that she'd brought her children here, let them hope for something, when she should have known better. She finally forced herself out of the van and walked slowly toward the barn, and it was then that she noticed the old pickup truck parked nearby, and a moment later, an elderly man emerged from the small general store building she hadn't even noticed tucked into the trees at the edge of the property. He was perhaps 70, wearing overalls and a faded flannel shirt, and he approached her with the cautious friendliness of someone who'd lived in small towns his whole life. "You must be Thomas's granddaughter," he said, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Frank Morrison, run the store just down the road about 2 miles. Saw your van and figured I'd come by, make sure you found the place all right." Sarah shook his hand, grateful for any human kindness. "Sarah Martinez. Thank you for checking on us." Frank's eyes moved to the barn, and his expression grew serious. "I'll be straight with you, Sarah. This property has been trouble for decades, ever since your grandfather bought it back in '78. Developers have been circling like vultures, waiting for it to fail, waiting for the taxes to finally take it. You should know what you're walking into here." Sarah spent the next hour walking the perimeter of the barn with Frank, who pointed out the structural damage with the careful honesty of someone who'd seen too many buildings collapse. The foundation was stone, which was good, but several support posts had rotted at the base where they met the ground. The roof needed complete replacement, and the entire west wall would need to be rebuilt from scratch, costs that Frank estimated, with uncomfortable precision, at somewhere north of $40,000 if she hired professionals. Maybe half that if she could do some of the work herself, which they both knew was an impossible dream. The children, meanwhile, had become explorers in their own private wilderness. And it was Lucia who made the first discovery, calling out to her mother, in a voice pitched high with excitement. Sarah found her youngest daughter kneeling in the overgrown grass at the base of the barn's stone foundation, her small fingers tracing something carved into the weathered rock. "Mama, look!" Someone made pictures. At first, Sarah thought it was graffiti, teenage vandalism from decades past, but as she knelt beside Lucia and really looked, She realized these weren't random markings. The symbols were carved deeply into the stone, precise and deliberate, a series of geometric shapes that formed a pattern. Circles within circles, lines that branched like lightning or tree roots, and strange angular marks that might have been letters from an alphabet she didn't recognize. The carvings were weathered, clearly old, and they ran along the foundation in a continuous band, disappearing around the corner of the building. "That's strange," Frank said, crouching down beside them with a grunt. "I've been past this barn 1,000 times, never noticed those before." Elena, always the quieter observer of the twin girls, had ventured inside through the massive main doors that hung crooked on rusted hinges, and her voice echoed from within the cavernous space. "Mama, there's more inside." Sarah's heart clenched with fear for her daughter's safety in the unstable structure, but she forced herself to walk calmly through the doors rather than run. The interior was vast and dim, dusty shafts of light streaming through gaps in the walls and roof, illuminating a space that was mostly empty except for ancient hay bales in one corner and what might have once been animal stalls along one wall. Elena stood in the center, pointing upward at the massive support beams that ran the length of the building, and Sarah's breath caught because there, carved into the old wood 20 feet above the ground, were more symbols, these ones even more elaborate, forming what looked almost like a map or diagram. Marcus and Matteo came running from somewhere in the back of the barn, Marcus carrying something triumphantly in both hands. "Mom, look what we found." It was a toolbox, old and rusted, the kind that might have held hammers and wrenches a generation ago. But inside, wrapped in what had once been oilcloth but was now mostly decomposed fabric, was a journal. The leather cover was water-stained and warped, many of the pages stuck together or illegible, but Marcus flipped it open to a page that had survived relatively intact, and Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. The page was covered in careful handwriting, her grandfather's name signed at the top, and scattered throughout the text were drawings, sketches of the same symbols they'd found on the foundation and beams. The children were chattering excitedly, Marcus insisting they'd found a treasure map, Matteo declaring it was probably pirates, Lucia wondering if it was a secret code, while Elena had already pulled out her notebook and begun copying the symbols with careful precision. Sarah looked from the journal to the carved beams above to the foundation outside, and she felt the overwhelming weight of everything pressing down on her. The $15,000 tax bill, the $40,000 in repairs, the mystery of symbols she didn't understand and didn't have time to understand, the desperate need to somehow turn this collapsing wreck into something, anything that could save her family. Frank stood beside her, his weathered face thoughtful as he examined the journal Marcus held. "Your grandfather was a surveyor, a geologist. These symbols, they might be his survey markers, coordinates maybe, or mineral notations. Thomas was always writing, always documenting everything he saw. But even as he spoke, Sarah could hear the uncertainty in his voice, because these symbols didn't look like any surveying notation she'd ever seen, and the careful, deliberate way they'd been carved into permanent stone and wood suggested something far more important than simple field notes. Frank left as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the mountains, promising to return the next day with some basic supplies and tools, and Sarah was left alone with her 4 children in the vast, damaged barn that was somehow supposed to be their salvation. She'd already forbidden the children from climbing into the loft, the upper level that ran along 2 sides of the barn where hay would have been stored generations ago, because the wooden floor was clearly rotted and dangerous. But Matteo had never been particularly good at following rules, especially rules born from caution rather than cruelty. And she heard his excited shout from above before she could stop him. "Mom, Mom, I found something." Her heart seized with terror as she ran to the base of the rickety ladder, looking up to see her son's dark head poking over the edge of the loft, his face illuminated with discovery rather than fear. "Matteo, get down here right now, that floor could collapse." But he was already scrambling down the ladder, moving with the fearless agility of 8-year-old boys, and when he reached the ground, he opened his palm to show her what he'd found, a key, large and ornate, made of iron that had rusted to a deep reddish brown but still held its shape. It was at least 6 inches long, with an elaborate bow decorated with what looked like the same geometric patterns they'd seen carved into the foundation, and the bit was complex, designed for a lock that required precision to open. It was hidden inside one of the beams up there. Matteo explained, breathless with excitement. "There's a beam that looks solid, but part of it is actually hollowed out, and this was inside, wrapped in old leather. The children gathered around as Sarah examined the key, turning it over in her hands, feeling the weight of it, the deliberate craftsmanship that had gone into its creation. Marcus immediately began trying it in every lock they could find, the rusted padlock on an old trunk in the corner, the door to what might have been a tack room, even the doors of the animal stalls. But nothing fit, the key clearly made for a lock they hadn't yet discovered. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped with the swift cruelty of mountain nights, Sarah realized with a mix of resignation and strange excitement that they'd be spending the night here, because she'd used the last of her gas money to make the drive, and wouldn't have enough to get back to town until her paycheck cleared in 2 days. She gathered the children into the least damaged corner of the barn, where the roof seemed sound and the walls solid, and they rolled out the sleeping bags she'd packed with the optimistic hope that this might become an adventure rather than a disaster. With the children settled around her, Sarah pulled out the water-damaged journal and a small flashlight, and began to read aloud the pages that were still legible. The handwriting was her grandfather's, strong and precise, dated from 1978, and it detailed his work as a geological surveyor for a company called Titan Industries, describing days spent in the Montana wilderness taking soil samples, mapping geological formations, and documenting mineral deposits. Many pages were stuck together or had been destroyed by water, creating frustrating gaps in the narrative. But what she could read painted a picture of a meticulous, thoughtful man who loved the work of understanding the earth beneath his feet. There were technical descriptions of rock formations that meant nothing to Sarah, sketches of geological cross-sections, and notes about equipment and methodology. But scattered throughout were more personal observations, comments about the beauty of a particular valley, concerns about the environmental impact of mining, and increasingly, a growing unease about something he'd discovered, though the pages that might have explained what that something was were missing, torn out or destroyed, leaving only fragments and questions. 2 days later, with the last few dollars from her checking account converted to gas, Sarah drove into Millbrook proper, leaving the children at the barn with strict instructions to stay on the ground floor and not leave the property. A decision that filled her with guilt, but necessity had long ago taught her that perfect parenting was a luxury she couldn't afford. Millbrook was a small mountain town of perhaps 3,000 people, its main street lined with the kind of businesses that seemed frozen in time. A hardware store, a diner with a faded neon sign, a feed supply store, a small grocery, and a bar that opened at 11 in the morning for reasons Sarah preferred not to consider. She started at the diner, figuring her experience waiting tables in the city might translate, and the owner, a heavy-set woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a stained apron, looked her up and down with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. "You're the Martinez girl, aren't you, Thomas's granddaughter?" The way she said it wasn't quite a question, and when Sarah confirmed, the woman's face shifted into something that might have been pity or might have been fear. "I'm sorry, honey. We're not hiring right now." The grocery store gave her the same response, delivered by a manager who wouldn't quite meet her eyes, and the feed supply store owner actually stepped back when she introduced herself, as though her last name carried some contagion. By noon, Sarah was sitting in her van in the parking lot behind the hardware store, fighting back tears of frustration and confusion, when an elderly woman tapped on her window. She was perhaps 80, with white hair pulled back in a neat bun and eyes that were sharp despite her age, and she leaned down to speak through the glass. Sarah hurriedly rolled down. "You should know what you're dealing with, dear," the woman said quietly, glancing around as though checking for eavesdroppers. "Your grandfather knew something important, something dangerous. That's why they isolated him, made him an outcast in this town for 30 years. People are afraid of that property, afraid of what it represents." Before Sarah could ask what she meant, the woman had shuffled away, disappearing around the corner of the building with surprising speed for her age, leaving Sarah with more questions than answers. She was still sitting there, trying to process the strange encounter, when Frank Morrison emerged from the back door of the hardware store, carrying a box of supplies. He loaded them into his truck before walking over to her van, his weathered face showing concern. "Heard you've been making the rounds, looking for work. I'm guessing you're not having much luck." Sarah shook her head, not trusting herself to speak without crying. Frank sighed, leaning against her van. "Your grandfather was the most brilliant man I ever met, Sarah. He could look at a hillside and tell you what was under the ground, could read rock formations like you and I read books, but something happened back in '78, something that changed him. He bought that property, built that barn with his own hands, and then just closed himself off from the world. Wouldn't talk to hardly anyone, refused to leave the property except for supplies. People started calling him paranoid, crazy, thought he'd lost his mind. Frank pulled out a business card from his shirt pocket and handed it to her. "I'm offering you credit at my store, whatever you need for basic repairs and supplies. Your grandfather was my friend, and I don't believe he was crazy. I think he was protecting something." Sarah took the card, her hand trembling slightly, the kindness almost more than she could bear after the morning's rejections. And Frank patted her shoulder before walking back to his truck, leaving her alone with the growing certainty that she'd inherited far more than a broken-down barn and a pile of debt. Frank arrived the next morning in his pickup truck loaded with supplies, lengths of lumber, boxes of nails and screws, a toolbox filled with equipment Sarah didn't know how to use, and several gallons of water because he'd noticed the well pump was broken. The children ran to greet him like he was a beloved uncle, and Sarah felt a warmth in her chest at their excitement, at the simple fact that someone had shown them kindness in a place where kindness seemed to be rationed like gold. While the twins helped unload the truck, treating it like an adventure, Frank gestured for Sarah to walk with him away from the barn, toward the edge of the property where the overgrown pasture met the dark line of pine forest. "I need to tell you some things about your grandfather," he began, his voice low and serious. "Things that might help you understand what you've gotten yourself into here." He explained that Thomas Martinez had been one of the most respected geological surveyors in the western United States, a man whose expertise was sought by every major mining company from Montana to New Mexico, a scientist who could look at exposed rock face and identify mineral deposits with uncanny accuracy, someone who'd spent 20 years building a reputation for integrity and brilliance. Then, in 1978, everything changed. Thomas was working on a survey for Titan Industries, a major mining conglomerate, when suddenly, without warning or explanation, he quit. Not just the project, but the entire profession. He used every penny of his savings to buy this 40 acres of seemingly worthless land, and then, working alone and refusing all help, he built the massive barn with his own hands over the course of 2 years. A feat that became local legend not for its impressiveness, but for its strangeness. "He became a ghost," Frank said, his eyes distant with memory. "Wouldn't talk to anyone except me, and that was only because I didn't ask questions, just brought him supplies and left. People in town started saying he'd lost his mind, that the isolation had made him paranoid, but I saw his eyes, Sarah, and they weren't the eyes of a crazy man. They were the eyes of a man carrying a terrible burden, a man who knew something he wished he didn't know." Frank explained that over the years, various companies had tried to buy the property, always offering prices that seemed absurdly high for land that had no obvious value, no road access, no utilities, nothing that would justify their interest. The most persistent had been Pinnacle Development Corporation, a massive conglomerate that had absorbed dozens of smaller mining companies over the decades, and they'd made offers every few years like clockwork, each time increasing the price, each time being refused by Thomas with absolute finality. "The last offer came about 6 months before your grandfather died," Frank continued. "They offered him $200,000 for 40 acres of land that the county assessor valued at maybe $30,000. When he refused, their lawyer, a slick man named Mercer, told Thomas that they'd get the land eventually, one way or another, that time was on their side." Frank turned to look directly at Sarah, his weathered face grave. 2 weeks later, Thomas had his first heart attack. The doctors said it was stress, and maybe it was, but I think your grandfather knew something. Discovered something on one of those surveys back in '78, something big enough that powerful people wanted it buried, and he spent 30 years of his life making sure it stayed buried, protecting it the only way he knew how, by becoming its guardian, by sacrificing everything to keep whatever secret lies beneath this land out of the wrong hands. Sarah had driven into Millbrook to meet with a county clerk about the tax situation, leaving the children with sandwiches and strict instructions to stay together and stay safe. And the moment her van disappeared down the rutted track, Marcus had retrieved the water-damaged journal from where his mother kept it carefully wrapped in plastic. The 4 children gathered in the cool morning shadow of the barn's east wall, and Marcus flipped through the fragile pages until he found the entry that had been nagging at his mind since he'd first read it. A page dated the 15th of September, 1978, where his great-grandfather had written in his precise script about following the serpent's spine to the heart of the secret. At first, it had seemed like poetic nonsense. But as Marcus read it aloud to his siblings, Elena, always the most observant, pointed out that the phrase was accompanied by a small sketch in the margin showing the same symbols they'd found carved into the foundation, arranged in a specific sequence that looked almost like a path. "It's directions," Marcus said, his voice rising with excitement. "The symbols aren't just decorations, they're markers, like a trail." The children moved along the foundation, Lucia and Elena calling out when they found the next symbol in the sequence, while Marcus kept the journal and Matteo traced the pattern with his finger on the stone. The symbols led them around the entire perimeter of the barn, a journey that took 20 minutes of careful searching through the overgrown grass and weeds. And the pattern was clear once they understood what they were looking for. Each symbol was slightly different, a variation on the circular geometric theme, and they formed a progression that spiraled inward, tightening like a snake coiling around its prey. The serpent's spine led them finally to the northeast corner of the foundation, to a section of wall that at first glance looked identical to all the rest, but when Elena knelt down to examine it closely, she noticed something the others had missed. "This stone is different," she said quietly, her small fingers tracing the edges. "See, the other stones have moss in the cracks, but this one doesn't, like it moves sometimes. Like the cracks open and close." Marcus flipped frantically through the journal, looking for more clues, and found a page that was mostly water-damaged, but showed a diagram of the symbols arranged in a specific pattern with numbers beside them. "I think we have to press them in order," he said, his heart hammering with the thrill of discovery. The children spread out along the foundation near the cornerstone, identifying each of the 6 symbols that appeared in the diagram, and on Marcus's count, they pressed them simultaneously. Marcus on the first symbol, Matteo on the second, Elena on the third and fourth because they were close together, and Lucia stretching to reach the 5th and 6th. At first, nothing happened, and disappointment began to settle over them like a cold fog. But then Matteo said, "Wait, we have to do them in sequence, not all at once, like a combination lock." They tried again, this time pressing each symbol in order, waiting a beat between each one, and when Lucia pressed the final symbol, they heard it, a deep grinding sound of stone moving against stone. A mechanical click that echoed from somewhere inside the foundation, and the different stone that Elena had identified, along with the 3 stones above it and 2 beside it, shifted inward about 2 inches, revealing a black gap around the edges. The children stared at what they'd uncovered, at the impossible reality of a hidden door built into the foundation of their barn, and in that moment, they understood that their great-grandfather's isolation, the town's fear, the mysterious offers from developers, all of it was real. All of it was connected to whatever lay behind this secret entrance that had been waiting 30 years for someone to find it. Sarah returned from town 3 hours later, exhausted and discouraged after learning that the county would not negotiate on the tax deadline and that her options were to pay in full, lose the property, or find a lawyer she couldn't afford to fight a system designed to grind down people exactly like her. And she found all 4 of her children waiting by the barn's entrance with expressions of barely contained excitement that immediately shifted her exhaustion into alarm. "What happened? Is everyone okay?" Marcus stepped forward, holding the journal carefully in both hands like it was made of gold rather than water-damaged leather. "Mom, we found something. We figured out what the symbols mean. And we found a door, a hidden door in the foundation, and we didn't go inside because you said never to explore without you. But Mom, you have to see this." Sarah's first instinct was to be angry that they'd been playing near the potentially unstable foundation, but the seriousness in her son's voice, the way all 4 children were looking at her with identical expressions of wonder and certainty, made her swallow the reprimand. They led her to the northeast corner, showed her the sequence of symbols, and when Lucia pressed the final marker in the pattern, Sarah watched in disbelief as the section of stone wall shifted inward with that deep grinding sound, revealing the black gap that looked like a doorway into the earth itself. "We need to call someone," Sarah said immediately, her mind spinning with possibilities, but Marcus shook his head. "Great-Grandpa Thomas hid this for a reason, Mom. Maybe we should see what's inside before we tell anyone." The logic was the logic of an 8-year-old, but something in Sarah agreed with it. Some instinct that whatever her grandfather had protected for 3 decades deserved to be understood before being exposed. She retrieved the heavy-duty flashlight from her van, gathered her children close, and pulled the stone door open wider, its hidden hinges moving smoothly despite decades of disuse, revealing a narrow staircase carved directly from the bedrock, descending into absolute darkness. "Stay close to me, hold on to each other, and if I say we leave immediately." No arguments. The children nodded solemnly, and Sarah began the descent, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness to illuminate stone steps that were steep but carefully carved, each one the same height, the work of someone who'd taken immense care in the construction. The temperature dropped as they descended, the air becoming noticeably cooler and carrying a faint mineral smell, and Sarah counted 23 steps before the staircase ended in a small landing and a chamber opened before them. The flashlight beam swept across a space that was perhaps 15 feet square, carved entirely from the bedrock with a ceiling just tall enough for Sarah to stand upright. And what she saw made her breath catch in her throat. The chamber was dry, protected from moisture by the careful construction, and along 3 walls stood metal filing cabinets, 4 of them, each bolted securely to the stone. Between the cabinets were shelves, also bolted in place, holding dozens of plastic containers of various sizes, all sealed and labeled with neat handwriting. In the center of the room sat a table made from a sheet of plywood resting on concrete blocks, and on that table was surveying equipment, a theodolite in its case, core sample tubes, a microscope covered with a plastic tarp, notebooks stacked in careful piles, and maps, so many maps, rolled and stored in plastic tubes. Everything was organized with military precision, labeled and preserved, the life's work of a man who had known exactly what he was protecting and had built this secret vault to ensure it survived him. With trembling hands, Sarah opened the first filing cabinet, its metal drawer sliding smoothly on well-maintained tracks despite 3 decades of disuse, and inside she found hanging folders, each one labeled with dates and locations, containing page after page of documents that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made to her. The papers were filled with technical terminology she didn't understand, words like lanthanides and rare earth oxides, chemical formulas with subscripts and superscripts, geological cross-sections showing layers of rock with labels like Precambrian basement and tertiary volcanics, and tables of numbers that seemed to go on forever. Columns labeled with abbreviations like ppm and WT% that meant nothing to her tired, overwhelmed mind. Marcus and Matteo had found the maps, pulling them carefully from their plastic tubes and unrolling them on the plywood table, and even Sarah could understand these. Topographical maps of the region, showing the barn property and the surrounding mountains, marked with hundreds of small colored dots, each one numbered, creating a pattern that looked almost like a constellation. Elena discovered the soil samples, dozens of small glass vials filled with dirt and rock fragments, each one labeled with coordinates that matched the dots on the maps, while Lucia found notebooks filled with her great-grandfather's careful handwriting, daily logs of his survey work from March through September of 1978. Sarah forced herself to focus, to look past the incomprehensible technical details and search for something, anything, that would explain why all of this had been hidden. It was in the second filing cabinet that she found what she was looking for. A folder labeled Titan Industries, Official Reports, and another labeled Actual Findings, Private. Her hands shook as she pulled both folders out and laid them side by side on the table. And even without understanding the technical details, the difference was immediately, shockingly clear. The official reports, the ones marked as submitted to Titan Industries, showed survey results for this region that were consistently negative or barely promising. Phrases like minimal commercial potential, trace amounts only, and not recommended for further exploration appeared again and again. But the private reports, the ones her grandfather had kept hidden, told an entirely different story. Sarah couldn't understand all the numbers, but she understood words like extraordinary, unprecedented concentration, and highest-grade samples ever recorded, and she understood the conclusion her grandfather had written in bold letters at the end of the private report dated September 30, 1978. The deposit beneath this property represents one of the richest concentrations of strategic minerals in North America, potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars. But recommending development would destroy the land and enrich men whose greed I have witnessed firsthand. The children had gathered around her, reading over her shoulders, and Marcus was the first to say it. Great-grandpa lied. He found something really valuable and told his bosses it was worthless. Sarah nodded slowly, her mind reeling with the implications. Her grandfather had committed fraud, had deliberately falsified scientific reports, had thrown away his career and his reputation, but the question that burned in her mind was why, and the answer, she suspected, was somewhere in these cabinets, in these carefully preserved documents that represented not just scientific data but a choice, a sacrifice, a 30-year vigil to protect something from people he believed would abuse it. Sarah was replacing the folders in the filing cabinet when Elena called out from where she'd been examining the shelves on the far wall, her small voice echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "Mama, there's a box here with your name on it." The box was metal, about the size of a shoebox, and indeed written on a label affixed to its lid in her grandfather's careful handwriting were the words, "For Sarah Martinez, my granddaughter, if she is the one who finds this." Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted the lid, and inside, wrapped in layers of plastic and protected by desiccant packets, was a waterproof envelope, the kind photographers use to protect negatives. She opened it carefully, and inside was a single photograph, standard size, the colors slightly faded with age but still clear enough to see every detail. The photo showed 4 men standing in front of a rocky outcrop somewhere in the mountains, their clothes and hairstyles marking it unmistakably as the late 1970s. The man on the far left was young, lean, and serious, and Sarah recognized him with a jolt as her grandfather Thomas, perhaps in his mid-30s, holding surveying equipment and looking directly at the camera with an expression that seemed, even across the decades, deeply troubled. Beside him stood 3 other men. One was heavy-set and jovial-looking, wearing a company shirt with a logo Sarah couldn't quite make out. Another was older with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who'd spent his life outdoors. And the third man, standing slightly apart from the others on the right side of the photo, was tall and handsome in an expensive outdoor jacket, his smile confident and cold even in the faded image. Sarah turned the photograph over, and her breath caught as she read the inscription on the back, written in her grandfather's handwriting but with a shaky quality that suggested deep emotion. Survey Site 7, the 12th of August, 1978. The day I learned what greed does to men. The day I chose silence over blood money. Left to right, Thomas Martinez. Paul Hendricks, deceased 1979. Robert Chen, Titan Industries, retired. James Mercer, Titan Industries, now Pinnacle Development. The name hit Sarah like a physical blow. James Mercer. Frank had mentioned that name just yesterday. The lawyer who'd made the final offer to her grandfather 6 months before his death. The man who'd said they'd get the land one way or another. But Frank had said he was a lawyer for Pinnacle Development, not its founder, not someone who'd been there at the beginning, standing in that photograph 47 years ago, when her grandfather made whatever discovery had changed his entire life. "Mom, who are these people?" Marcus asked, but Sarah couldn't answer because her mind was racing, connecting pieces that she didn't want to connect. If Mercer had been there in 1978, if he'd been part of the original survey team, then he knew exactly what was under this land, had known for decades, and every offer, every pressure, every attempt to acquire the property hadn't been speculation or development opportunity. It had been a deliberate, patient hunt for something specific, something valuable enough to wait 30 years for, something her grandfather had discovered and then hidden by falsifying his own reports, destroying his reputation and his career to keep it out of the hands of men whose greed he'd witnessed firsthand. Men like James Mercer who were still hunting, still waiting, still circling like wolves around the secret buried beneath 40 acres of Montana wilderness. The sleek black SUV appeared 2 days later, its polished surface and chrome accents a jarring contrast to the rutted dirt track and overgrown wilderness, announcing wealth and power in a place that had known neither for decades. Sarah was outside with the children, attempting to patch a section of the barn's west wall using the lumber Frank had provided, when she heard the approaching engine. A smooth purr rather than the struggling rattle of working vehicles, and her stomach clenched with instinctive alarm. The SUV came to a stop beside her ancient minivan, making the comparison almost cruel, and a man emerged from the driver's side with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. He was in his mid-60s, tall and distinguished, with silver hair perfectly styled and an expensive outdoor jacket that probably cost more than Sarah made in 3 months, and his smile was practiced, warm, designed to put people at ease. "You must be Sarah Martinez," he said, extending a hand as he approached. "I'm James Mercer, CEO of Pinnacle Development Corporation. I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced. But I was in the area and wanted to introduce myself personally. Sarah shook his hand automatically, her mind screaming with recognition. This was the man from the photograph. 47 years older, but unmistakably the same person. The man her grandfather had worked with. The man whose greed had driven Thomas into 3 decades of isolation. And she had to force her face to remain neutral, to not reveal what she knew. Mercer's eyes swept over the barn with an expression of carefully constructed sympathy. I understand you've inherited quite a challenge here. This old structure. It's really a liability more than an asset. And the property taxes, well, I imagine those are causing you considerable stress. He gestured for her to walk with him, away from where the children were playing, and Sarah found herself following, her body moving on autopilot while her mind raced. I'll be direct with you, Sarah, because I respect your time and your intelligence. This land, it's worthless for anything except development. There's no road access, no utilities. The soil is poor for farming, but my company specializes in turning properties like this into something useful. Recreational developments, small communities, that sort of thing. I'm prepared to offer you $100,000 cash for the property, enough to pay off the tax debt, relocate somewhere more suitable for your family, and give you a fresh start. The number was staggering, more money than Sarah had ever imagined having, enough to solve every immediate problem, to give her children stability, to stop the constant grinding terror of poverty, and for a moment, she felt the seductive pull of surrender. Mercer must have seen the hesitation in her face, because his smile widened. But when Sarah didn't immediately accept, when she said quietly that she needed time to think, something shifted in his expression, the warmth draining away like water through a sieve, leaving something cold and hard beneath. Of course, take your time, though I should mention the tax deadline is approaching rapidly, only 73 days now, and fighting the county would be expensive, and I think you'll find futile. They want their money, and they're not known for their patience with people who can't pay. He pulled a business card from his jacket and pressed it into her hand. My personal number. Call me when you're ready to be reasonable. He walked back to his SUV, and just before climbing in, he turned and looked directly at Sarah with eyes that held no warmth at all. Your grandfather was a stubborn man, Sarah. It caused him nothing but pain and isolation. I'd hate to see you make the same mistake. Sarah waited until Mercer's SUV had disappeared down the track, its dust settling back onto the overgrown grass, before she allowed herself to breathe normally again. And that night, after the children were asleep in their sleeping bags, she used her phone's camera to photograph every page of her grandfather's reports that she could understand. Dozens of images that filled her phone's limited storage, focusing especially on the pages that showed the comparison between what Thomas had told Titan Industries and what he'd actually found. The next morning, she drove to the Millbrook Public Library, a small brick building that smelled of old books and floor wax, and found an empty computer terminal in the back corner where she could work without being observed. She started with the basics, searching for rare earth elements, and what she found made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and dread. Rare earth elements, she learned, weren't actually rare in the sense of scarcity, but were incredibly difficult and expensive to extract from the earth, and they were absolutely critical to modern technology. Smartphones, computers, electric vehicles, wind turbines, military guidance systems, and countless other applications all depended on these 17 obscure elements with names she could barely pronounce, like neodymium, dysprosium, and terbium. More importantly, she discovered that in 1978, when her grandfather had been conducting his survey, rare earth elements were considered interesting but not particularly valuable, used in small quantities for specialized applications. But over the following decades, as the digital revolution transformed the world, their value had exploded, and now, in 2024, these materials were worth billions, considered so strategically important that countries fought over access to them, and the United States was almost entirely dependent on foreign sources, primarily China, for its supply. She searched for information about Titan Industries and found references to their 1,978 survey program across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, looking for mineral deposits that might be commercially viable, and she found Thomas's official report, the falsified one, filed with the U.S. Geological Survey as a matter of public record, stating clearly that the region around what was now her property showed trace amounts of rare earth oxides below commercial viability, not recommended for further exploration. But the private reports she'd photographed told a completely different story. Her grandfather's actual findings, the measurements he'd taken from dozens of sample sites across the property, showed concentrations of rare earth elements that even Sarah, with her limited understanding, could see were extraordinary. Numbers that were 10, 20, sometimes 50 times higher than the samples from other locations, consistent across multiple test sites, indicating not a small pocket but a massive deposit that extended beneath the entire 40 acres and likely beyond. She found a geology forum and, using a throwaway email account, posted anonymous questions about what concentrations would be considered commercially viable, and the responses from actual geologists made her hands shake. The numbers in her grandfather's private reports were, in their words, exceptional, world-class, and, if verified, would represent one of the most significant rare earth deposits in North America. One geologist had written, "A deposit with those concentrations could be worth hundreds of millions, possibly billions depending on the exact composition and accessibility." Sarah sat back in the hard library chair, staring at the glowing computer screen, and understood with crushing clarity what her grandfather had done. He had found a treasure, a deposit that in 1978 had been interesting but not life-changing, but which he'd somehow known or suspected would become invaluable, and he'd lied, committed fraud, destroyed his own career and reputation to hide it, spending 30 years as a recluse, protecting it from men like James Mercer, men whose greed he'd witnessed, men who would have torn the land apart for profit without a second thought for the consequences. The county inspector arrived on a Tuesday morning, driving a white truck with official markings, and he was young, perhaps 25, with a clipboard and an apologetic expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Derek Chen, said he was responding to a complaint about unsafe structures on the property, and proceeded to walk around the barn with Sarah following, taking notes and photographs while she tried to explain that she was in the process of repairs, that she'd only owned the property for 3 weeks, that she was doing everything she could with limited resources. When he finished his inspection, he handed her a violation notice, stating that the barn was structurally unsound and poses an immediate danger to public safety, and that she had 30 days to either bring it up to code, at an estimated cost he'd calculated at $85,000, or demolish it at her own expense, and failure to comply would result in daily fines of $500 until the violation was corrected. Sarah stared at the paper in her hands, at the impossible numbers, and asked who had filed the complaint since the property was a mile from the nearest neighbor and no one even knew it existed. But the inspector just shook his head and said complaints could be filed anonymously. It was county policy. That same week, Sarah had finally found work at a diner 2 towns over, a place where her last name meant nothing, and she'd worked 3 shifts, grateful for the income, even though the drive ate up most of what she earned in gas, when the owner, a tired woman named Jean, pulled her aside during the lunch rush and said she was sorry, but she couldn't keep Sarah on because someone had filed a formal complaint with the health department about Sarah's hygiene practices, which was absurd and obviously false. But the health inspector had come by and Jean couldn't afford the scrutiny, couldn't risk her license. And Sarah understood because she'd been poor long enough to know that the system wasn't designed to be fair. It was designed to protect people who already had power. On Friday, she came out of the library where she'd been researching rare earth element prices and found all 4 tires on her minivan slashed, clean cuts that were clearly deliberate, and the repair shop quoted her $600 she didn't have, forcing her to use the emergency credit card she'd sworn she'd never touch again, the one with the 28% interest rate that she'd been trying to pay down for 3 years. Frank found her that evening sitting on the barn's front step, her head in her hands, and he sat down beside her with the comfortable silence of someone who understood that sometimes words weren't helpful. Finally, he spoke. "Mercer's doing this to you. It's his playbook. I've seen it before with other landowners he wanted to pressure. First comes the generous offer, then when you refuse, the system starts working against you. Inspectors find violations that didn't exist before, jobs disappear, equipment breaks down in suspicious ways, and it all happens just fast enough that you can't prove anything but slow enough that it looks like natural bad luck." Frank pulled out a folded newspaper from his jacket, opened it to a page he'd marked, and showed Sarah an article from 15 years earlier about a rancher named Thomas Kovac, who'd owned land adjacent to a Pinnacle development project, refused to sell, and within 6 months had faced code violations, lost his bank financing, and eventually declared bankruptcy, losing everything. Kovac tried to fight it, hired lawyers, but Mercer's got judges in his pocket, county officials on his payroll, and more money than anyone can match. And by the time people realize what's happening, they're already drowning. Sarah looked at the article, at the photograph of a defeated man standing in front of his foreclosed ranch, and felt the cold certainty that she was being systematically destroyed, that the barn, the taxes, even Mercer's visit, all of it was part of a machine designed to grind her down until she had no choice but to surrender. In desperation, born from watching her world systematically dismantled, Sarah spent an evening searching university websites until she found Professor Helen Chen at Montana State University, a geologist whose research focused specifically on rare earth element deposits in the Rocky Mountain region, and she sent an email at midnight from a library computer using a throwaway account, attaching several of the photographs from her grandfather's private reports and asking, in carefully vague terms, whether these findings seemed legitimate and whether someone might be interested in verifying decades-old survey data. She expected no response, or at best a polite dismissal, but the next morning there was a reply marked urgent. These numbers, if authentic, are extraordinary. I need to know where this data came from. This is critically important. Please call me at the number below. Sarah used the last minutes on her prepaid phone to make the call, and Dr. Chen answered on the first ring, her voice sharp with scientific excitement barely contained by professional caution. She was perhaps 50, Sarah guessed from her tone, with the rapid-fire speech pattern of someone whose mind moved faster than conversation allowed. And within 5 minutes of Sarah explaining the situation, carefully leaving out names and specific locations, Dr. Chen had cut through the preliminaries with startling directness. If these reports are accurate, and I emphasize if, because I'd need to verify the actual samples, you're looking at one of the richest rare earth deposits ever documented in North America, potentially worth hundreds of millions of dollars at current market prices, possibly billions depending on the exact elemental composition and the deposit's full extent. Sarah felt her breath catch, hearing the numbers spoken aloud by someone who actually understood what they meant. And Dr. Chen continued, her voice dropping lower as though worried about being overheard. You need to understand what you've stumbled into here. Rare earth elements are classified as strategic materials, critical for national security. Every smartphone, every electric vehicle, every wind turbine, every precision-guided missile depends on these elements. And right now, the United States imports over 80% of our supply from China, which gives them enormous geopolitical leverage. A domestic source of this magnitude would be a game-changer, worth far more than just its market value. Dr. Chen asked careful questions about where the samples came from, who knew about them, and whether anyone was pressuring Sarah, and when Sarah mentioned Pinnacle Development and James Mercer, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. I know that name. Pinnacle absorbed Titan Industries back in the 1980 seconds, and Titan had a reputation, a bad one. They were known for environmental devastation, for strip mining operations that left entire valleys poisoned, for prioritizing profit over everything else. There were congressional investigations, lawsuits, communities that still haven't recovered 40 years later. The pieces suddenly clicked into place in Sarah's mind with stunning clarity, and Dr. Chen voiced what Sarah was beginning to understand. If your grandfather discovered this deposit in 1978 while working for Titan, and if he understood what kind of company they were, what they'd do to extract those minerals, he might have made the choice to hide it, to falsify his reports to protect the land from being destroyed, knowing that someday, maybe decades later, technology would exist to extract rare earths more cleanly, more responsibly, or that someone else would find it and make better choices. Dr. Chen agreed to drive out to the property that weekend, secretly, to verify the preserved samples and conduct her own analysis, and she warned Sarah in a voice tight with concern that if Mercer knew about the deposit, if he'd been waiting decades for Thomas to die so he could finally claim it, then Sarah was in more danger than she realized, because men don't wait 47 years for something unless it's worth absolutely everything. Dr. Helen Chen arrived on Saturday evening just as the sun was dropping behind the western mountains, driving a nondescript rental sedan rather than her personal vehicle. And she'd told no one at the university where she was going, taking precautions that seemed paranoid, until Sarah saw the intensity in her eyes and understood that this woman knew exactly how dangerous the situation had become. She was younger than Sarah had imagined from her voice, perhaps 45, with short black hair streaked with gray and the focused energy of someone for whom scientific inquiry wasn't just a job but a calling, and she carried 2 heavy cases of equipment into the barn, after Sarah assured her the children were spending the night with Frank at his house, away from whatever might unfold. Sarah led her down the hidden staircase into the stone chamber, and Dr. Chen stood for a long moment, just taking in the preserved laboratory, the filing cabinets, the careful organization, before she whispered, "Your grandfather was brilliant. This is a time capsule, a perfect preservation of primary research data." She spent the next 3 hours working with an intensity that Sarah found mesmerizing, carefully opening the sealed containers of soil samples, examining them under a portable spectrometer she'd brought, running tests whose purposes Sarah didn't understand, but whose results clearly shocked the professor again and again. Her muttered exclamations of "impossible" and "unprecedented" filling the small chamber. Finally, as midnight approached, Dr. Chen sat back on the concrete floor, her hands shaking slightly as she removed her gloves, and looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed scientific awe with deep concern. "They're authentic. Every sample I've tested matches your grandfather's private reports exactly. And Sarah, those reports were conservative. The concentrations are even higher than he documented, particularly for neodymium and dysprosium, which are the most valuable and strategically critical elements. I'd estimate, and this is a conservative estimate based on the sample density and the property's acreage, that the mineral rights alone are worth between $200 and $300 million at current market prices. Possibly more if extraction proves efficient. The numbers were so large they felt abstract, meaningless, but Dr. Chen wasn't finished. I did some research after our call, pulled corporate records and historical documents. Titan Industries, the company your grandfather worked for, was acquired in 1985 by Western Mining Consolidated, which was itself absorbed by Pinnacle Development Corporation in 1994. All of Titan's assets, including their survey data, their records, everything, it all became Pinnacle property. She pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a corporate family tree she'd constructed, lines connecting companies across decades, and at the center of it all was Pinnacle Development, and listed as its CEO and majority shareholder was James Mercer. This is what you need to understand. Mercer wasn't just an employee at Titan in 1978, he was a junior executive who positioned himself to eventually take over. When your grandfather falsified those reports, Mercer would have seen the official version, the one claiming minimal deposits, but he was there, Sarah. He was at the survey site. He would have suspected, maybe even known, that Thomas was lying, and he spent 47 years positioning himself to own this land, waiting for your grandfather to die, waiting for the property to fall into the hands of someone who wouldn't know what they had, someone he could pressure or intimidate or buy out cheaply. Dr. Chen's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, urgent and frightened. He doesn't just want your land, Sarah. He's been hunting this deposit for nearly half a century, and now that he's finally close to claiming it, he won't stop until either he owns it or you're completely destroyed. Dr. Chen pulled out a yellow legal pad and began sketching a timeline with the urgent precision of someone planning a military operation, her pen moving rapidly as she explained what Sarah needed to understand about mineral rights law and why timing was absolutely critical to their survival. The moment your grandfather died and this property passed to you, the mineral rights came with it. But mineral rights on federal lands or lands with potential strategic resources are complicated. You need to file formal claims with the Bureau of Land Management and submit documentation to the U.S. Geological Survey establishing that you've discovered economically viable deposits, and once those claims are filed and verified, they create legal protections that make it much harder for someone like Mercer to simply take the land through tax foreclosure or legal pressure. She showed Sarah the forms that would need to be completed, the documentation required, the samples that would need to be submitted for independent verification, a process that normally took months but which Dr. Chen believed could be expedited if they could prove national security implications and if they had the right allies in federal agencies. But that's only half of the strategy. Dr. Chen continued, flipping to a new page. The bigger weapon you have is the evidence your grandfather preserved, when Thomas submitted those falsified reports to Titan Industries in 1978. Titan used that data to file environmental impact assessments with federal and state agencies, claiming the land had no significant mineral deposits, and therefore any development they did would have minimal environmental consequences. Those assessments became part of the public record, part of the justification for permits and acquisitions Titan made throughout the 1,980 seconds. And when Pinnacle absorbed Titan, they inherited not just the assets but the legal framework built on Thomas's lies. Sarah began to see where this was going, and Dr. Chen nodded at her expression. If you can prove that Titan's original surveys were fraudulent, that they knew or should have known about the actual deposits, then every environmental permit, every land acquisition, every regulatory approval Pinnacle received that was based on those false surveys could be challenged. We're not just talking about this property, Sarah. We're talking about potentially invalidating decades of Pinnacle's operations across 3 states, exposing systematic fraud that could cost them billions in penalties and lost projects. The plan was elegant and terrifying in equal measure. File the mineral rights claims immediately to establish legal standing, then deliver Thomas's evidence to federal authorities, specifically the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Interior, and, if necessary, the FBI's Corporate Fraud Division, creating a situation where Pinnacle couldn't simply buy or bully their way to ownership because the entire federal government would be investigating them. But Dr. Chen's expression darkened as she checked her watch. The problem is timing. You have 68 days until the tax deadline, and Mercer knows that's his window. If the county seizes the property for unpaid taxes, it goes to auction, and Pinnacle will be there with cash, ready to buy it legally before your claims can be processed or any investigation can begin. We need to file the mineral rights claims within the next week, get the evidence to federal authorities within 2 weeks, and somehow either pay those taxes or get the deadline extended. And Sarah, I have to tell you, Mercer has spent 47 years preparing for this moment. He'll have lawyers, politicians, judges, all lined up to make sure that deadline isn't extended, to make sure every legal avenue you try gets blocked, to make sure you're crushed before you can expose what he's been hiding. Dr. Chen looked at Sarah with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and determination. This is going to be the fight of your life, and you're going to be going up against someone with infinite resources and no conscience, but you have something he doesn't have. You have the truth. You have evidence that can't be denied, and you have a grandfather who spent 30 years making sure that when this moment came, when someone finally found what he'd hidden, they'd have everything they needed to win. Dr. Chen had left just after 1 in the morning, taking with her carefully sealed samples and copies of the most critical documents, promising to begin the filing process first thing Monday morning. And Sarah had driven to Frank's house to collect her sleeping children, carrying them one by one from his guest room to the van, their warm bodies heavy with sleep, and she'd brought them back to the barn because it was the only home they had, spreading their sleeping bags in the hidden chamber rather than the exposed main floor, because something in her gut, some instinct honed by years of watching for threats, told her that tonight was when Mercer would make his move. She was right. At 3:15 in the morning, Sarah woke to the sound of vehicles outside, multiple engines, and she clamped her hand over her own mouth to keep from crying out, then moved silently to wake the children, her finger to her lips in the universal gesture for silence. And Marcus and Mateo understood immediately, their eyes going wide but their bodies staying still. While Lucia grabbed her stuffed rabbit and Elena reached for her sister's hand, and Sarah gathered all 4 of them, herding them down the hidden staircase into the stone chamber with a speed born of pure terror. She pulled the stone door closed just as she heard the barn's main doors being forced open above, the sound of splintering wood and metal echoing through the structure, and in the absolute darkness of the chamber, she felt her children pressed against her, their breathing shallow and frightened, and she held them close, one arm around the twins, the other around the girls, becoming a human shield between them and whatever was coming. The sounds from above were methodical and terrifying, footsteps, multiple sets, moving across the barn floor, the crash of furniture being overturned, the screech of metal as filing cabinets were pulled open, and voices, men's voices, speaking in low, urgent tones about searching every corner, checking every board, finding what they came for. The intruders were ransacking the barn with professional efficiency, clearly looking for something specific, and Sarah knew with sickening certainty that they wanted her grandfather's evidence, the documents that could destroy Mercer, and she held her children tighter, praying that the hidden chamber would remain hidden. Then Marcus, shifting his weight in the cramped darkness, accidentally bumped against one of the plastic sample containers on the shelf behind him, and it fell. The sound of hard plastic hitting stone floor impossibly loud in the enclosed space, and above them, the footsteps stopped. Sarah felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her chest, and the children had all frozen, even 7-year-old Lucia pressing her face into Sarah's shoulder without making a sound. And they waited in the suffocating darkness, hoping, praying that the intruders hadn't heard. But they had. Footsteps approached directly overhead, moving toward the northeast corner of the barn where the hidden entrance was located, and then more footsteps joined them, and a voice said, "There's something down here. I heard something under the floor." Sarah heard them walking along the foundation outside, their boots crunching on gravel. And then the beam of a powerful flashlight cut through the gaps in the stone door, illuminating thin lines of light in their darkness, and the children pressed even closer to her, and a man's voice, cold and analytical, said, "Look at these carvings. These aren't random. This is a pattern, some kind of sequence." She heard the sound of someone taking photographs, the click and flash of a camera, and another voice, younger and uncertain, asked, "Should we try to open it?" And the first voice replied, "We don't have time, and we don't know what's down there. Could be structural, could be nothing. Mark the location and we'll come back with equipment." Sarah clutched her children in the absolute darkness, feeling Lucia trembling against her, hearing Mateo's ragged breathing. And she made a choice in that moment, a mother's choice, that whatever happened, whatever it cost, she would keep them safe, she would fight with everything she had, and these men, whoever they were, whatever power stood behind them, would not take her children's future. Sarah heard the sound of fingers tracing the carved symbols on the foundation outside, methodical and patient. And then the voice said, "It's like a combination lock. Press them in sequence." And she felt the children stiffen against her as the first grinding sound echoed through the stone, the ancient mechanism beginning to activate. And she knew they had seconds before the door opened and they were discovered, trapped in a hole in the ground with no escape, and 4 terrified children depending on her. But then, cutting through the night like a battle cry, came a voice Sarah recognized. "What the hell are you doing on this property? I've called the sheriff. They're on their way." It was Frank, and the effect was immediate. The grinding stopped, footsteps scrambled away from the foundation, and she heard men shouting to each other, engines starting, the sound of vehicles tearing away down the rutted track with desperate speed. And only when the night had been silent for a full minute did Sarah push the stone door open from the inside, emerging into the pre-dawn darkness to find Frank standing by the barn with a rifle in his hands, and his old pickup truck's headlights illuminating the scene. "I saw trucks go past my place, 3 of them, moving without lights, and I knew they weren't headed anywhere good at 3 in the morning," Frank said, lowering the rifle as Sarah climbed out, followed by her children. "I called the real sheriff. He should be here in 20 minutes. But Sarah, you need to understand something. Those men will be back, and next time they'll come prepared, come in daylight with legal papers or lawyers or whatever tools Mercer has, and this barn, this property, it's not defensible. Not against what's coming." He ushered them quickly to his truck, and once the children were safely in the extended cab, wrapped in the blanket he kept behind the seat, he pulled Sarah aside and spoke in a low, urgent voice. "Your grandfather showed me something, years ago, made me swear I'd never tell anyone unless there was no other choice, and Sarah, we're past that point now. There's an old mining tunnel on this property, dates back to the 1922 when they were digging for silver in these mountains, and it runs from about 200 yards north of the barn, all the way through the hillside, and comes out near the Forest Service Road about 3 miles from here. Thomas kept it maintained, kept it clear, said it was his escape route if things ever got bad enough that he needed to disappear." Frank pulled a hand-drawn map from his jacket pocket. Clearly something Thomas had made decades ago, showing the tunnel entrance hidden beneath a collapsed mining shed that looked like it had been abandoned for a century. "If you're ever trapped here, if Mercer's men come and you can't get away by the road, you take your children into that tunnel and you run. It's narrow and dark and it's a hard walk, but it comes out to safety." And Thomas made sure it would always be passable, because he knew, even 30 years ago, that someday the secret he was protecting would make him, or whoever came after him, a target. Sarah took the map with shaking hands. Understanding that her grandfather had spent 3 decades preparing not just to hide his discovery but to protect whoever would eventually inherit the burden of that knowledge, and Frank squeezed her shoulder with rough kindness before saying, "We're getting you and those kids out of here tonight. You'll stay at my place until we figure out the next move, because Sarah, those men weren't burglars, they were professionals, and they'll be back, and next time they won't run." Sarah spent the pre-dawn hours at Frank's house unable to sleep, her mind racing with the reality that masked men had broken into the barn, had nearly discovered the hidden chamber, had been seconds away from finding her children, and she understood with brutal clarity that the evidence hidden beneath the barn was both her greatest weapon and her most dangerous vulnerability. Because as long as it remained there, Mercer would keep coming for it, would keep escalating, would eventually succeed in either stealing it or destroying it, and with it, any chance she had of fighting back. When the sun finally rose, painting the Montana sky in shades of orange and gold that seemed obscenely beautiful given the terror of the previous night, Sarah made her decision. She gathered Frank and Dr. Chen, who had driven back immediately when Frank called her about the break-in, and she laid out a plan that was risky but necessary. They would move the evidence, photograph every single page, package the physical samples and documents, and get them into the hands of federal authorities before Mercer could make another attempt. Because the barn was compromised, the location was known, and waiting was simply giving him time to prepare a more effective assault. Frank drove Sarah and the children back to the property in broad daylight, reasoning that Mercer's men wouldn't attempt anything in full view when the previous night's break-in might have already been reported to actual law enforcement, and they worked with desperate efficiency. Sarah and Dr. Chen in the hidden chamber, cataloging and photographing while Frank stood watch above with his rifle, and the children, bless them, helped by carrying equipment and holding lights, understanding without being told that this was serious, that their mother was fighting for their future. They photographed every page of every document, Dr. Chen using a high-resolution camera to capture even the finest details of survey maps and assay reports, and they created 3 complete digital copies, storing them on separate encrypted drives that would be delivered to different locations, a redundancy that felt paranoid, until Sarah remembered men in masks searching her barn at 3 in the morning. The physical evidence was more complicated. Dr. Chen selected the most critical soil samples, the ones that most clearly demonstrated the deposit's extraordinary value, and packaged them in sealed containers with proper chain of custody documentation, the kind that would hold up in federal court, while the original journals and maps were carefully wrapped in archival materials, every page photographed before being sealed away. By noon, they had created a complete archive, digital copies that could be distributed and verified, physical samples that could be independently tested, and documentation that told the complete story of Thomas Martinez's discovery and his 30-year campaign to protect it from exploitation. Frank loaded everything into his truck, hidden in toolboxes and equipment cases that wouldn't draw attention, and Sarah made the hardest decision of all. She would keep only 2 things: her grandfather's original journal, the water-damaged one that had started this entire journey, and a single verified soil sample, sealed and documented by Dr. Chen, enough to prove she had evidence but not enough to be the entire case, insurance against the moment when Mercer realized what she'd done. Dr. Chen left first, heading directly to Bozeman, where she had contacts at the federal building, people she trusted who could receive the evidence and begin the process of routing it to the appropriate agencies. The EPA for the environmental fraud aspects, the Department of Interior for the mineral rights questions, and the FBI for what was increasingly looking like a decades-long conspiracy involving corporate fraud and possibly worse. Frank would follow a different route, taking the physical samples to the U.S. Geological Survey office in Butte, where his cousin worked and could ensure they entered the official system properly. As they prepared to leave, Frank checked his watch and said something that made Sarah's blood run cold. "You know the tax deadline is Monday, right? That's 72 hours from now. We got the evidence out just in time, because Mercer's going to make his move this weekend. He'll either try to stop you from paying the taxes, or he'll pay them himself and claim some legal right to the property, or he'll find some other way to use that deadline as a weapon, because Sarah, he's been planning this for 47 years, and he's not going to let a single weekend stand between him and what he's been hunting." Sarah looked at her children, safe for the moment in Frank's truck, then at the barn that had become the center of a battle she'd never asked to fight, and she understood that the next 72 hours would determine everything. that Mercer knew time was running out, that he'd become desperate, and desperate powerful men were the most dangerous kind, and she had no money to pay the taxes, no legal standing yet to challenge the system, and only the hope that somewhere in the federal bureaucracy, someone would see her grandfather's evidence and understand its importance quickly enough to matter. James Mercer arrived at Frank's house on Sunday morning, the day before the tax deadline, and this time there was no pretense of charm, no carefully constructed warmth. Just a man in an expensive suit standing on Frank's porch with two lawyers flanking him like attack dogs and an expression on his face that was pure, cold calculation. Frank had refused to let him inside, so they stood in the yard while Sarah's children watched from the window. And Mercer looked at Sarah with eyes that held nothing but contempt for someone he clearly viewed as an obstacle rather than a person. "Let's dispense with the theater, Sarah. I know you found the chamber. I know what's inside, and I know you've been talking to people, moving things around, thinking you're being clever." His voice was flat, businesslike, the voice of someone discussing a routine transaction rather than the destruction of a family. "I'm here to make you a final offer, one that's far more generous than you deserve given the trouble you've caused. $500,000, cash, deposited in any account you specify, plus a legally binding confidentiality agreement that prevents you from discussing anything related to this property, your grandfather, or Pinnacle Development. In exchange, you sign over the deed. You take your children, and you disappear, and everyone walks away from this situation intact." Sarah stood with her arms crossed, her body physically shaking with a mixture of fear and rage, and she said the word that she knew would change everything. "No." Mercer's expression didn't change, but something dark flickered behind his eyes, and he nodded slowly as though she'd confirmed something he'd already known. "I was hoping you'd be smarter than your grandfather, but I see that stubbornness runs in families. Let me explain something to you, Sarah. Let me lay out exactly what your refusal means, because I don't think you understand the situation you're in." He gestured to one of the lawyers, who handed him a tablet, and Mercer pulled up documents that he showed to Sarah with the casual cruelty of someone displaying trophies. "The judge who will hear any dispute about the tax deadline, Judge Patricia Hartman. She's my former law partner from 20 years ago. We still have dinner once a month. The county commissioners who set tax policy. Pinnacle Development donated $250,000 to their last election campaigns. The sheriff who would investigate any complaints you might file. His department's new training facility was funded entirely by a Pinnacle grant. The county attorney who would prosecute any claims you make. He worked for our legal team for 5 years before moving to public service." He lowered the tablet and looked at Sarah with an expression that might have been pity if it held any actual human feeling. "I own this county, Sarah. I own the legal system you'd need to fight me. I own the politicians who'd need to support you. I own every lever of power that you'd try to pull. And even if you somehow found a way around all of that, even if you got federal authorities interested, which would take months or years, I have 73 law firms on retainer and unlimited resources to tie you up in legal proceedings until you're so buried in debt and court appearances that your children get taken away by social services because you're deemed an unfit mother who can't provide basic stability." Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one calculated to strip away another layer of hope, and Mercer wasn't finished. "You have 4 children who need food, shelter, education, stability. How long do you think you can provide that while fighting me? How many court dates can you attend before you lose whatever employment you manage to find? How many lawyers' fees can you pay before you're bankrupt? Your grandfather was a single man with nothing to lose, so he could afford 30 years of isolation and paranoia. But you, Sarah, you have everything to lose, and I will take it from you, piece by piece, day by day, until you have nothing left but regret and the knowledge that you could have taken $500,000 and given your children a future." He pulled a business card from his pocket and held it out to her. And when she didn't take it, he placed it on the porch railing. "You have 24 hours to accept my offer. At midnight tonight, the tax deadline passes, the county seizes the property, and Pinnacle will be there at the auction with cash, and everything your grandfather died protecting will belong to me anyway. Just like I always knew it would, and you'll have nothing, not even the money I'm offering now. Choose wisely, Sarah, because this is the last choice you'll get to make." That night, after Mercer had left and Frank had made sure his property was secure, After the children had been fed and bathed and tucked into sleeping bags in Frank's guest room, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen with a cup of coffee she wasn't drinking, staring at the business card Mercer had left, at the phone number that represented surrender and safety, and the betrayal of everything her grandfather had sacrificed, and she felt something inside her break. The careful wall she'd built to hold back the terror and exhaustion finally crumbling, and she put her head down on the scarred wooden table and wept. She cried for her grandfather who'd spent 30 years alone protecting a secret. She cried for her children who deserved better than a mother who'd dragged them into danger. She cried for the impossibility of the choice she faced, because Mercer was right. She had everything to lose, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing her, grinding her down into someone who was seriously considering taking the money, signing the papers, and walking away from the fight. She didn't hear Lucia come into the kitchen, didn't realize her youngest daughter was standing beside her chair, until small fingers touched her arm. And Sarah looked up through tear-blurred eyes to see all 4 of her children standing there in their pajamas. Marcus and Matteo side by side with identical expressions of determination. Elena holding her notebook, and Lucia clutching both her stuffed rabbit and her great-grandfather's journal, the one they'd been reading together every night. "Mama," Lucia said in her soft 7-year-old voice, "remember what Great-Grandpa Thomas wrote, the part we read last week?" She opened the journal to a page she'd marked with a ribbon, and she read aloud in the careful pronunciation of a child still learning big words. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's deciding that something else matters more." Sarah felt fresh tears streaming down her face, but these were different, and Marcus stepped forward, his 8-year-old face showing a seriousness that broke her heart. "Mom, we know you're scared. We're scared too. That man who came today, he was mean, and he said bad things, but we talked about it, all of us, and we want to vote." Sarah blinked, confused, and Matteo explained, "Like a family vote. We're a family, so we should all get to decide together. Do we take the money and leave, or do we fight?" The formality of it, the childish solemnity mixed with genuine courage, was almost too much to bear. And Sarah wanted to tell them that children shouldn't have to make decisions like this, that she was the mother, and it was her job to protect them from exactly this kind of burden. But Elena, always the quietest, spoke up before she could. "We already voted, Mama, before we came in here. It was unanimous." She stumbled slightly over the big word, but got it right, clearly proud of herself. "That means we all agreed. We fight." Lucia nodded vigorously, her curls bouncing. "This is our home. The barn is ours. Great-Grandpa Thomas wanted us to have it, wanted us to protect it, and we can't just give up because some mean man says scary things. You taught us that bullies win when good people are too afraid to stand up." Marcus pulled out his phone, the cheap prepaid one Sarah had given him for emergencies, and held it up. "And I have an idea. If the police won't help, if the government people are too slow, we record everything. We record what's happening. We write down what that man said today, and we send it to every news station, every newspaper, every person on the internet until someone listens. Because, Mom, this isn't just about us anymore. Dr. Chen said those minerals are important for everybody, for the whole country, and if we let a bad man steal them just because he has money and power, then we're saying that people like him always win, and I don't want to live in a world where that's true." Sarah looked at her 4 children, at these extraordinary small humans who'd inherited not just their great-grandfather's land but his courage, his conviction that some things mattered more than safety or comfort or even survival, and she felt the broken pieces inside her beginning to knit back together, not into what they'd been before but into something stronger, something forged by the knowledge that she wasn't fighting alone, that she had these 4 reasons to be brave standing right in front of her. And she reached out and pulled them all close, all 4 of them piling into her lap and arms despite being too big for it, and she whispered into their hair, "Okay, we fight. All of us, together." The tax deadline was Monday at midnight, and Sarah spent that final day in a state of numb resignation mixed with defiant hope, sitting at Frank's kitchen table with her children, waiting for either salvation or destruction, neither of which she could control, when at 11:45 in the morning, 12 hours and 15 minutes before everything would be lost, she heard the sound of vehicles approaching, multiple engines, and her first thought was that Mercer had sent his men again, but Frank, who'd gone to the window, said in a voice filled with wonder and relief, "Sarah, you need to see this." She looked out to see not black SUVs but government vehicles, 4 of them, plain sedans with federal license plates, and men and women in dark suits and windbreakers marked with 3 letters that made Sarah's knees go weak: FBI. They were led by a tall African-American woman in her 50s who identified herself as Special Agent Monica Reeves, and behind her came representatives from the Department of Interior, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the U.S. Geological Survey, an entire convoy of federal authority that had descended on rural Montana like an avenging army. Agent Reeves asked to speak with Sarah privately, and in Frank's living room, with her children pressed against her sides because she refused to let them out of her sight. The agent explained what had happened in the 72 hours since Dr. Chen had delivered Thomas's evidence. Dr. Helen Chen walked into our Bozeman field office on Friday afternoon with documentation of what may be one of the most significant corporate fraud cases in the history of American mining, and she refused to leave until someone in authority reviewed it. The evidence your grandfather preserved is extraordinary, Miss Martinez. It's not just survey data. It's a complete record of systematic fraud spanning nearly 5 decades. Agent Reeves opened a tablet and showed Sarah photographs of documents she recognized, her grandfather's careful handwriting now digitized and annotated by federal investigators who'd worked through the weekend. In 1978, your grandfather discovered a rare earth element deposit of strategic national importance while working for Titan Industries. His private records show he documented the discovery thoroughly, but the official reports he submitted to Titan and to federal agencies grossly understated the deposit's value and extent. Normally, that would make your grandfather guilty of fraud, but his personal journals, which Dr. Chen also provided, explain his reasoning. He witnessed conversations between Titan executives, including a young James Mercer, discussing how they would exploit the discovery, including plans to falsify environmental impact assessments to minimize regulatory oversight and maximize extraction speed regardless of environmental consequences. Sarah felt her heart pounding as Agent Reeves continued, her voice taking on the cold precision of someone reciting charges. Your grandfather's falsified reports became the basis for environmental permits Titan secured throughout the 1,980 seconds, not just for this property but for dozens of adjacent parcels they acquired based on the assumption this region was mineral poor. When Pinnacle Development absorbed Titan in 1994, James Mercer, by then a senior executive, ensured those fraudulent assessments remained buried in corporate archives. For 30 years, Pinnacle has operated mines, filed permits, and acquired land across Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, using environmental impact data they knew or should have known was false. And the evidence suggests Mercer specifically targeted properties near your grandfather's land, systematically buying up adjacent parcels while waiting for Thomas Martinez to die so he could finally claim the deposit he'd known about since 1978. The scope of it was staggering, and Agent Reeves wasn't finished. We've spent the past 72 hours executing search warrants on Pinnacle Development offices in 5 states. We've seized corporate records, emails, financial documents, and we've interviewed 17 current and former employees, several of whom have provided testimony confirming that Mercer knew about your grandfather's actual findings and spent decades positioning himself to exploit them. We have evidence of bribes paid to county officials, including the very officials involved in your current tax situation. We have documentation of harassment campaigns against other landowners who refused to sell to Pinnacle, and we have proof that Mercer personally ordered the break-in at your property last week. Sarah felt dizzy, the room seeming to tilt, and Marcus gripped her hand tightly while Lucia pressed her face into her mother's side, and Agent Reeves's expression softened slightly. James Mercer was arrested 3 hours ago at his home in Billings. He's being charged with corporate fraud, environmental crimes, conspiracy, and about 15 other federal violations, and based on what we're finding in Pinnacle's records, those charges will likely expand. The tax deadline on your property has been suspended indefinitely, pending our investigation, and the Department of Interior has issued a temporary protective order preventing any sale or transfer of the land until the full extent of the mineral deposits can be assessed and proper procedures can be established. She closed the tablet and looked at Sarah with an expression that held both professional satisfaction and personal respect. Your grandfather spent 30 years protecting this discovery, and you, Miss Martinez, in less than a month, you've helped us expose one of the largest corporate fraud schemes in modern mining history. The rare earth deposits beneath your property are estimated to be worth between $200 and $300 million, and because you own the land and the mineral rights, and because your grandfather's documentation proves you came by that ownership legitimately, while Pinnacle's claims were based on fraud, that value belongs to you and your children. In the weeks that followed, as winter's grip slowly loosened on the mountain and the first brave shoots of spring began to push through the melting snow, the full truth of Thomas Whitaker's decades-long vigil finally came to light, piece by careful piece, like a puzzle assembled from fragments scattered across 40 years of silence and sacrifice. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by documents that Detective Morrison had recovered from Mercer's office before his arrest, alongside the detailed journals Thomas had kept hidden in a fireproof safe beneath the cabin's floorboards. Journals that chronicled not just his geological observations but the terrible burden he had carried alone through 4 decades of self-imposed exile. The story that emerged was both heartbreaking and heroic, a testament to one man's unwavering integrity in the face of corruption, greed, and mortal danger. It had begun in the summer of 1978, when Thomas Whitaker, then a promising young geologist working for a small independent survey company, had been partnered with James Mercer on a routine mineral assessment contract for Titan Resources in these very mountains. The two men had spent 3 months conducting core samples, geological mapping, and chemical analysis of the rock formations, working side by side in what Thomas had believed was collegial partnership. Then, on August 14, 1978, Thomas had made the discovery that would alter the course of his entire life, a massive rare earth element deposit, larger and richer than anything found in North America up to that point, a find that would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars, potentially billions, as global demand for these elements grew. Thomas had been elated, believing he had just secured both men's careers and provided Titan Resources with an extraordinary asset. But when he shared the findings with Mercer that evening at their field camp, his partner's reaction had been unexpected and chilling. Mercer had not celebrated. Instead, his eyes had grown cold and calculating as he outlined a different plan entirely. They would falsify their report to Titan, declaring the area geologically uninteresting and economically worthless, then quietly use their combined savings to purchase the land through shell companies before anyone else understood its value, wait a few years for the contract to expire and memories to fade, then discover the deposit themselves and sell the rights for an enormous personal profit. Thomas had refused immediately, horrified by the suggestion that they betray their client's trust and deceive the company that had hired them in good faith, but Mercer had been prepared for resistance. Over the next 3 days, as Thomas insisted they must submit an honest report, Mercer's persuasion had turned to pressure, then to threats, and finally to something far more sinister. He had shown Thomas photographs of his young wife and infant son, images taken without their knowledge outside their home in Denver, and he had made it clear, in language that left no room for misinterpretation, that Thomas's family would suffer terrible consequences if he did not cooperate with the falsified report. Thomas had been trapped, caught between his professional ethics and his primal need to protect the people he loved most in the world, and in the end, love had won. He had helped Mercer submit a fraudulent survey report to Titan Resources, declaring the mountain range geologically inactive and commercially worthless, watching as their supervisor accepted the findings without question and closed the file on the project. But Thomas had not been willing to let Mercer profit from the deception, and he certainly had not trusted the man to keep his family safe once the scheme was complete. Instead, Thomas had made a different choice, one that would cost him everything he had worked for but would ensure the deposit remained protected from Mercer's greed. He had used his entire life savings, liquidating his retirement accounts and taking out loans against everything he owned, to purchase this remote parcel of land before Mercer could act, securing it in his own name and moving here permanently, cutting ties with his career, his colleagues, and eventually most of his family to maintain the isolation necessary to guard his secret. For 40 years, Thomas had lived on this mountain, enduring winters that would break lesser men, poverty that made every day a struggle, and the profound loneliness of exile, all while knowing that Mercer was out there, building his career on the foundation of their shared lie, rising through the ranks of the very industry Thomas had been forced to abandon. Thomas had kept meticulous records, gathering evidence and documentation, waiting for the moment when he could finally expose the truth without putting his family at risk, and that moment, he had decided, would come after his death, when Mercer could no longer threaten anyone he loved. The journals revealed that Thomas had chosen Sarah specifically as his heir, not randomly but deliberately. After quietly investigating his scattered descendants and learning that she had children of her own, two young souls who would benefit from the land's eventual value and who would give her the same fierce protective instinct that had driven his own 4 decades of sacrifice, ensuring she would fight for the truth rather than succumb to Mercer's inevitable pressure. And in this calculation, made in the final months of his life as cancer slowly claimed him, Thomas Whitaker had proven himself a judge of character whose faith in his granddaughter's courage and integrity had been entirely, remarkably justified. The formal assessment came on a brilliant morning in late April, when 3 independent geological firms, working under court supervision to ensure absolute impartiality, delivered their final reports to Judge Patricia Chen's chambers, and the number they presented was staggering in its magnitude, a figure that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The rare earth element deposit beneath Thomas Whitaker's mountain property was valued, at current market prices and projected demand over the next 50 years, at $215 million, a sum that transformed Sarah from a struggling single mother worried about next month's rent into one of the wealthiest landowners in the state, though the weight of that wealth felt less like freedom and more like profound responsibility. Judge Chen, who had overseen the entire legal proceedings with careful attention to both justice and environmental concerns, granted Sarah full and uncontested ownership of the mineral rights, but with provisions that Thomas himself would have insisted upon had he lived to see this day. Any future mining operations would be required to meet the strictest environmental standards available under current law, with regular third-party audits, mandatory reforestation programs, water quality monitoring, and wildlife protection measures that would ensure the mountain Thomas had guarded for 40 years would not be destroyed in the process of extracting its treasures. Within days of the announcement, Sarah found herself fielding calls from mining companies around the world, but she quickly learned to distinguish between those who saw only profit and those who genuinely shared her commitment to responsible stewardship. 3 ethical companies, all with proven track records of sustainable mining practices and community partnership, presented proposals that balanced economic development with environmental protection. And Sarah began the careful process of evaluating their offers, consulting with environmental scientists, legal experts, and community leaders to ensure that whatever decision she made would honor both her grandfather's sacrifice and the land he had protected. The old barn, which had housed not just Thomas's decades of solitary labor but also the meticulous documentation of his heroic resistance against corruption, was formally recognized by the State Historical Society as a site of significant cultural and historical importance, a monument to one man's unwavering integrity in the face of overwhelming pressure. Preservationists worked with Sarah to restore the structure, carefully maintaining its weathered authenticity while ensuring it would stand for generations, and plans were developed to eventually open it as a small museum where Thomas's journals, his geological samples, and the evidence of his quiet courage could be displayed for visitors who might draw inspiration from his example. But for Sarah, the greatest challenge was not managing the wealth or the attention or the complex negotiations with mining companies. It was determining how to use this unexpected inheritance in a way that would create lasting positive change, rather than simply securing comfort for herself and her children. She thought of Thomas, living in poverty for 40 years while sitting atop a fortune, and she thought of the families in her neighborhood who struggled as she had struggled, working multiple jobs and still falling behind, sacrificing their health and their time with their children just to keep the lights on and food on the table. She thought of the children she had taught, bright minds trapped in underfunded schools without the resources to reach their full potential. And she thought of the elderly neighbors who had helped her in those early desperate days on the mountain, people who had lived lives of quiet dignity despite economic hardship. These thoughts crystallized into a vision, and within 6 months of receiving ownership, Sarah had established the Thomas Whitaker Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to 2 primary missions that reflected both her grandfather's values and her own hard-won understanding of what families truly needed. The foundation would fund educational opportunities, providing scholarships for children from low-income families, grants for underfunded schools, and support for teachers who went above and beyond their job descriptions to ensure every student had a chance to succeed. Equally important, it would provide direct assistance to families living in poverty, helping them with emergency expenses, job training, childcare support, and the kind of practical aid that could mean the difference between losing a home and maintaining stability during difficult times. Sarah recruited Maria, whose kindness during those first terrible weeks had meant so much, to serve on the foundation's board, and together they began building an organization that would touch thousands of lives in the years to come. The legal settlements with Titan Resources and with Mercer's estate, both of which had been held liable for their roles in the decades-long conspiracy, provided additional funding for the foundation's work. And Sarah insisted that every dollar be spent with the same careful attention to genuine impact that Thomas had brought to his geological surveys before corruption had forced him into exile. As she signed the papers that formally established the foundation, sitting at the desk in the cabin where Thomas had spent so many lonely evenings documenting his burden, Sarah felt a profound sense of connection across the years to a grandfather she had never known, understanding finally that his true legacy was not the fortune beneath the mountain, but the example of choosing principle over profit, family over personal gain, and long-term protection over short-term reward. Values she was now determined to carry forward into a future he had made possible through 4 decades of sacrifice. 6 months later, on a golden October afternoon when the aspens flamed yellow against dark pines and the high country air felt clear and sharp, Sarah stood in the clearing with her 4 children, taking in what they had built from pain, resilience, and an old man's quiet wisdom. The barn remained where it always had, its weathered timbers still intact, but every part of it had been restored and reborn, not as a relic but as a living tribute. The once heavy sliding door now moved with ease, welcoming visitors into the front half, now a modest museum showcasing Thomas Whitaker's geological samples, journals, and photographs of the mountain he had dedicated his life to protecting. The back half had become a vibrant community center with a kitchen, tables, and open space regularly filled with classes, support groups, and neighbors gathering over coffee. Nearby, separated by a stretch of wildflowers and native grasses planted by Lucia and Elena, stood a beautiful new home. Modest but warm, with a wraparound porch and windows that captured the mountain view, the house gave each child their own room, something they had never known. Sarah had worked with an architect to ensure the home felt in harmony with the barn, using similar materials and design touches that made past and present blend seamlessly. The land around them had been thoughtfully cleared of overgrowth while preserving the trees and rocky terrain that gave it soul. Lucia and Elena had started a thriving garden, and Marcus and Matteo, once reluctant about their move, had found purpose in the local geology club, even leading field trips and helping design museum exhibits. Their grandfather's passion had become theirs, his meticulous notes studied with the awe other kids gave to games. The transformation spread outward too. The Thomas Whitaker Foundation, which Sarah managed closely, had begun funding local scholarships, science programs, and emergency assistance for struggling families, rippling hope into the wider community. As Sarah stood watching Marcus and Matteo head into the museum and the girls harvest autumn vegetables behind her, she realized the money had changed their lives, yes, but the true gift Thomas left was not the millions. It was his example of integrity, of quiet resistance, of choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. That legacy, now rooted in her children, was priceless.